Its application to limitations deriving from economic interests. The case that interests us here is of the same type. The purely intellectual sequences of the psychic process cannot be completely separated from those that carry economic interests whose basic character prevents such a separation, not so much in individual or exceptional cases but in the general context of individual and social life. If this restricts the absolute independence and freedom of purely intellectual labor, then it will be more unlikely to do so, the less the bond concerns a specific economic object. If it is possible, in this context, to base the sequence of economic interests solely upon their most general interest, then the intellectual sequence will gain a distance from it which could not be maintained if the sequence of economic interests were to center around a specific object, requiring specific attention. In this respect, the most suitable kind of property was, for a long time, the ownership of land. Its kind of management, the immediate utility of its products and their regular marketability all permit a relative differentiation and uninterruptedness of intellectual energies. Yet only the money economy heightened this quality to such an extent that someone could be an intellectual worker and nothing else. Money is so much an exclusively economic value and is so far removed from any economic specificity that, within psychological contexts, it grants the greatest amount of freedom to purely intellectual activity. The latter's diversion is minimized, differentiation of the inner series, which here too may be termed being and having, is maximized. Thus, a complete concentration of consciousness upon non-material interests makes possible the independence of intellectuality within the division of labor, which in turn results in the evolution of the above-mentioned classes of purely intellectual production. The intellectual flowering of Florence in comparison with Genoa and Venice, which were equally wealthy and endowed with talents, has been attributed partly to the fact that these two had become rich during the Middle Ages largely through commerce, whereas the Florentines, ever since the 13th century, had become rich mainly as bankers. The nature of banking required less specific work and left them more freedom for the development of higher interests. One phenomenon that at first glance seems to contradict money's emancipatory effects is the development of direct taxation. It seems to contradict them because it intensifies the relationship of the person to money while nevertheless eventually having the same importance. During the early decades of the 19th century, direct taxes were all tied to the object, land, buildings, enterprises, possessions of all kinds bore the tax. Regardless of the personal circumstances of the owner or manufacturer, regardless of whether he was in debt or really managed to secure a normal profit. This type of tax is no more commensurate with the individual than is the poll tax, which is the most impersonal of all known forms of taxation. The bearer of the tax on real estate and trading capital is the owner of the object who is somehow determined individually by this ownership and differs from others who do not own exactly the same object. Even in the Middle Ages in Germany there was a distinction between the dependent and the more privileged tenant farmer. The former paid a per capita rent, every member of the court or the district the same, while in the case of the latter individually arranged rents were raised and were differentiated according to the objective situation. The tax on objects, which forms systematically, though not historically, the second stage that moves toward personalism, is followed historically by taxes on social classes. Their basis was not yet the real individual income of the citizen, but rather was formed according to the main social and economic differences between the major classes within whose wider limits the individual was placed according to his overall social and economic circumstances. Only the present state tax seizes upon the exact personal income, so that all that is individually specific is reduced to mere elements which are not decisive at all. Viewed more closely, this increasingly precise adjustment of tax to one's personal situation in a growing money economy implies increased personal freedom. For this process belongs to the trend towards that differentiation of life processes by which each single one remains strictly within its own area and leaves every other as far as possible unaffected. The most objective principle, the poll tax, most thoughtlessly ignores personal differences in circumstances. Every other tax that is not an exact function of individual income but has to be paid out of this income also transgresses its proper sphere and enters into others where it does not at all belong. As is so often the case, the same process that we observed between the economic and other spheres of life repeats itself among the various elements of the economy. Such a relationship was already present when it was demanded, at the first dawning of liberal ideas in the 18th century, that the individual's minimum level of subsistence be free of taxation and that the minimum level of existence of the different estates be set accordingly. Here too we find the tendency for taxes to be adjusted at first negatively by what they exempted to particular circumstances while leaving purely personal existence completely untouched. And if recently property taxes have reversed this trend to some extent by being imposed on money and physical assets regardless of the income they produce, then this has its origin in the social standpoints that are quite alien to the interest in individual liberty. Both positive and negative instances illustrate the fact that, with the growing importance of money, taxes as the shadow of property are located in an increasingly differentiated manner in their appropriate series and, through pliant flexibility, leave as much liberty as possible to the totality of economic life and to life in general. The fact that the relationship of the state to its citizens is determined basically by a monetary relationship has its origin primarily in taxation. This refers to a correlation which is important in the present context and may be presented in the following manner. If social strata are primarily differentiated by their money income, then a policy based on the various strata is very restricted because the most divergent objective interests are bound up with the same money income, and therefore any measure taken in the interests of one stratum unavoidably harms many interests within that particular stratum. It is, for instance, impossible to have a uniform middle-class policy if one understands by middle-class levels of income those between 1,200 and 3,000 marks. For those who are included in this group, businessmen, manual workers, peasants, artisans, white-collar workers, people of independent means and civil servants have almost no parallel interests in other points of legislation. The problems of tariff policy, of the protection of labor, of rights of association, the furthering of wholesale or retail trade, of trade regulations including those of residence requirements and of Sabbath observance will be answered in the most contradictory manner within this complex. The same is true for big business and large landed estates which, in terms of their income, belong to the same stratum but, in terms of political interests, belong to completely different camps. The fusion of any one class on the basis of the formal criterion of money income thus loses practical, political significance altogether. The state thereby becomes more dependent upon measures that fit the totality and diversity of interests. This development may be diverted or covered over by countless countervailing forces. However, in principle, one consequence of the replacement of groupings in terms of vocation and birth by groupings in terms of income is that the qualitative interests that are inexpressible in quantitative terms destroy the external significance of status complexes and thereby direct public policy towards an objective level that exists above any kind of classification. This is part of a very typical correlation between the most perfect objectivity and the most perfect consideration of the subjective which has been revealed by the development of taxation. Furthermore, I wish to show that money provides the technical possibility for the creation of this correlation in basic social relationships as well. I have emphasized several times the medieval theory which gave to every commodity a just price, that is an objectively fair price, an arithmetical equilibrium between money and real value, and which sought to regulate legally against its upward or downward movement. The result had to be subjective in the worst sense of the word and arbitrary, inadequate valuation that made a momentary constellation into a fetter for future developments. A just and appropriate price could not be brought about through a process of direct leveling but rather by taking account of the overall state of the economy, the many-sided forces of supply and demand, the fluctuating productivity of people and objects as price-determining factors. Although this excluded the individually binding fixing of prices, and had to abandon to the individual the estimation of a continually changing situation, prices were now determined by much more real factors and were, as a result, objectively more commensurable and just. This development could be improved upon still further. A thoroughgoing ideal of fairness would shape prices, not only by codetermining the complications and changes of super-individual moments but also the extent of the state of the personal assets of the consumers. Individuals.